Midnight rain draped over Canyon Hill. A veteran's SUV hummed home after a month away, and in the back seat, Rex lifted his head as the neighbor's call kept vibrating through the speaker. She said little Emily's voice had gone silent for days, and a strange, rotten smell was seeping from his ex-wife's apartment. Jack rushed upstairs, kicked the door open, and froze. His 5-year-old daughter was kneeling beside a trash bin, trying to swallow something no child should ever be forced to eat, while his ex-wife was lying on the sofa, headphones on, casually eating grapes as if nothing was wrong. What happens next may break you and make you believe in second chances. Stay with us until the end of this story to witness how love can save a child from the darkest moments. Wishing you a peaceful day filled with kindness. The night rain fell in heavy, slanting sheets over Canyon Hill, a cold, relentless storm that swallowed the streetlights and blurred every familiar shape into trembling shadows behind shimmering curtains of water. It was far too late for any father to be returning home, yet Jack Carter drove through the downpour with his jaw clenched and his hands locked around the wheel, the weight of a month away on assignment still dragging at his shoulders. At 42, weathered in the way veterans often were, broad-shouldered beneath an olive-green field jacket, dark stubble shading a tired jaw, a black baseball cap pulled low over eyes sharpened by years of vigilance, Jack carried a heaviness that did not come from travel alone. His daughter, Emily, bright and gentle in the way children often are before the world teaches them otherwise, was living for now under the roof of his ex-wife, Vanessa, and the thought of it stirred a quiet dread that no storm could drown out. He was awaiting the court's decision on his custody appeal, a process slow enough to bruise a man's patience, and every mile tonight pressed harder on him as he imagined his little girl in a home where he trusted neither the walls nor the silence, nor the woman who filled them. Beside him in the passenger seat, Rex had grown restless minutes ago. The 6-year-old German shepherd, heavy-boned and proud with black saddle markings across his back, was usually composed during every ride, but now the dog stood half-crouched, ears stiff, a low rumble vibrating from deep in his throat. Jack knew the sound well. It wasn't agitation or confusion, it was warning, an instinct honed both by nature and by the years Rex had spent at his side. The closer they drove to the block where the apartment stood, the more the dog's muscles coiled as if bracing for whatever waited ahead. Jack whispered a quiet command, not to silence him, but to steady himself. The storm outside was loud, but the silence inside the car felt louder, filled with all the meanings he didn't want to interpret. Halfway down Canyon Hill Drive, his phone rang, sharp and frantic in the enclosed space. The name flashing on the cracked screen jolted him more than the thunder. Agnes Whitmore, the elderly neighbor who had known everyone on that floor long before Jack first moved there. Her voice burst through the speaker the moment he answered, trembling and breathless, reporting that she hadn't heard Emily's voice for 2 or 3 days, that something foul seeped into the hallway, that Vanessa had told police a flimsy, impatient lie. "She has the flu, officer. She just needs rest." Jack heard every word as though it were a shard of ice pressed against his spine. Agnes rarely panicked. She was practical, steady, a widow who still remembered the rhythm of raising 5 children. For her to sound like this meant something was deeply wrong. The call ended, but the echo of it stayed, stirring up a sensation Jack hadn't felt in years. It wasn't fear so much as recognition. A soldier learns to differentiate noises and silences, and it was the silences that had always unnerved him most, the suffocating, unnatural quiet that fell before an IED detonated, or just before a young private collapsed from heat stroke in a tent thick with darkness. Tonight's quiet carried that same weight. He could feel it pressing against his ribs as he pressed harder on the accelerator. The rain kept hammering the windshield, yet somehow it couldn't drown the rhythm of Rex's growl, steady and insistent like the ticking of a countdown. When Jack pulled into the lot, he didn't bother parking straight. He swung the door open, boots splashing through puddles, and Rex was out beside him in one swift leap. They rushed toward the stairwell, the dog tugging ahead as though following a scent that confirmed every suspicion. The building's hallway lights flickered dimly, lending a sickly pallor to the walls as Jack sprinted up each flight, his breath burning hot in his chest. He had come home exhausted many times before, but never like this. never with the fear that the only person who still tethered him to hope might be suffering just behind a closed door. At apartment 3B, the air felt wrong, too still, too stale. Rex's claws scraped anxiously against the floor as he aligned himself with the door, growling low from the pit of his lungs. Jack pounded with the side of his fist, his voice hoarse as he called out, listening for any tremor, any shuffle, any sign of a child inside. Instead, a pause stretched painfully long before a woman's voice drifted through the wood. Vanessa's voice, cool and unbothered, with that familiar sharp edge she used when she wanted to dismiss him. "Go away, Jack. She's studying." The calmness in her tone didn't soothe, it chilled. A mother who had nothing to hide would have opened the door, would have spoken with even a shred of alarm or fatigue. But Vanessa sounded like someone lounging through a lazy Sunday, not a storm-soaked night in a home where a child might be suffering. Jack stepped back only to gather force. He drove his boot into the lock, then his shoulder, channeling the muscle memory of Afghanistan, breaching doors, clearing rooms, trusting instinct over hesitation. The wood splintered on the second strike, swinging inward with a groan that echoed down the hallway. Rex burst in first, nose low, body taut like a drawn bow. Jack followed with his breath lodged somewhere between fury and dread, scanning the dim living room where shadows stretched too long across the floor. And there she was, not Emily, not the child he'd imagined kneeling on the floor or curled in fear, but Vanessa, lounging casually on the sofa as though he had merely interrupted a quiet evening. Her blonde hair was gathered in a careless knot, noise-canceling headphones pushed slightly off one ear, a bowl of grapes balanced on her thigh. She didn't startle or flinch. She barely moved at all. She looked at Jack with the lazy indifference of someone watching an uninteresting commercial, her eyes glazed in the cold way that had once been familiar to him, but never this grotesque. The apartment smelled stale, a thick mixture of damp neglect and something metallic hiding beneath the surface. Vanessa plucked a grape, popped it into her mouth, and finally spoke, her tone flat and devoid of anything human. "She's in the kitchen," she said, as if announcing where someone had left a misplaced backpack. "Discipline," she added, still chewing, "builds character." Her gaze drifted back to her phone, thumb scrolling without hurry. The rain pounded the windows, Rex growled again, and somewhere beyond that living room doorway, silence waited like something crouched in the dark. Jack felt a rush of heat rise beneath his collar, not anger exactly, but a deep, sick certainty that tonight was going to carve itself into memory whether he wanted it to or not. The storm outside suddenly felt distant, almost gentle compared to the storm now tightening inside his chest. He took one breath, steady but trembling around the edges, and stepped forward toward the kitchen doorway, with Rex at his heel and the weight of dread settling heavier with each step, knowing that the worst truths were always found in places where no sound dared to exist. The kitchen doorway opened into a darkness thickened by the storm. But inside the apartment, the air carried a smell that did not belong to any home, a sour, stagnant heaviness that clung to the walls as though it had been building for days. The dim bulb above the sink flickered weakly, casting an uneven halo across the cold linoleum floor, and in that faint, trembling light, Jack saw Rex planted squarely before the entrance, the German shepherd's body pressed low to the ground, with his tail tucked and hackles raised in a rigid line down his spine. The dog's breath came in short bursts, the kind that signaled not fear, but the readiness of a creature about to fight for a life he understood mattered, and his eyes, amber and sharp, stayed trained on the darkness ahead, as if bracing for something neither of them were prepared to face. The sound of the storm faded behind the walls, replaced by Rex's low, vibrating growl, a growl so deep it felt as if it rose from the foundation of the building itself. Jack stepped past him with unsteady hands, and the sight that unfolded in the corner of the kitchen carved the breath out of his chest with a force no battle had ever managed. On the cold floor sat Emily, 6 years old, small and slight, wearing a faded beige polka-dot dress that clung to her knees as though it had not been washed in days. Her face, streaked with dirt, carried smudges where tears had dried into thin lines, and her blonde hair hung in tangled clumps around her cheeks as she sat hunched over a crust of mold-speckled bread. Her small hands trembled as she lifted it, her fingers so thin that they seemed to strain under the weight of something far greater than the piece of food she tried to swallow. She ate in tiny, desperate bites, each one punctuated by a stifled sob, as though she believed crying itself might bring punishment. The dim light above her shivered across her features, revealing a child who had run out of ways to be brave. For a moment, Jack remained frozen, unable to move, his emotions collapsing inward like a building stripped of its support. He had imagined fear on the drive home, imagined the worst possibilities that could lurk behind this door. But nothing, had prepared him for the image of his daughter crouched beside a trash bin that reeked of spoiled leftovers and rot. Emily pressed the bread to her lips again, her small shoulders shaking with each breath, and she whispered something inaudible, as if apologizing to the room itself. Her thin arms quivered as she forced down another bite, and Jack felt a pain bloom inside him with a sharpness he had not experienced even in war. The air seemed to tilt around him, the kitchen shrinking to a single point where a child tried to survive inside the ruins of someone else's cruelty. When he finally forced his legs to move, Jack knelt beside her, knees hitting the cold floor as though the ground itself demanded reverence for the moment about to shatter him. His breath caught in his throat as he reached toward her, and as Emily's head turned at the sound of him, the fear in her eyes stole whatever strength he thought he had left. She tried to sit straighter, as though being seen eating from the trash was yet another sin she feared she must explain, and a soft hiccup escaped her lips as she tried to speak, but could not form a word. Jack's touch landed gently on her back, feeling the fragility beneath her dress, and he murmured her name with a tenderness cracked open by shock, watching her trembling deepen under the warmth of his hand. Behind them, Rex shifted into position with a suddenness that cut through the room like a blade. The dog placed himself between Jack, Emily, and the doorway, where Vanessa now stood partially visible, still holding her bowl of grapes, as if the scene before her required no more attention than a commercial break on a show she wasn't invested in. His growl sharpened, rising in volume, filling the kitchen with a warning so primal that the hair on Jack's arms lifted. The ridge along Rex's back swelled into a bristle, and his front paws planted firmly as he prepared to defend the broken child on the floor. Jack did not look back at Vanessa, not yet, but the dog's posture told him everything he needed to know about the nature of the woman who had let this happen. Vanessa herself shifted only slightly when Jack finally turned, lifting another grape without a flicker of discomfort, her face arranged in an expression so devoid of empathy that it seemed carved rather than alive. Her posture remained elegant, almost theatrical, as she leaned lightly against the frame, the cold glow of her phone screen illuminating her cheekbones while the storm rattled the window behind her. "She skipped dinner," she said in a detached tone, as if reciting a line she had practiced. "I told her to finish the portion she ruined." Her voice held no malice, only a chilling calm, the kind of indifference that made cruelty seem like a casual preference rather than a choice. She popped the grape into her mouth with a smooth motion, her eyes drifting away from them as though they were an interruption to an evening she intended to enjoy. Emily gagged then, her small body convulsing as her stomach rejected what she had forced into it, and she leaned forward with a soft cry that barely carried in the heavy air. Jack reached out just in time, steadying her as she vomited onto the floor in a weak, shaking spasm, her body folding into his arms as though drained of all strength. The moment she slumped against him, her breath hitched once more, her eyelids fluttering with a faint, confused tremor, and then she went limp. Jack caught her easily, she weighed almost nothing, and held her head against his chest as panic surged through him in a silent, devastating wave. He pulled her closer, feeling the heat of her forehead, the faint rasp of her breath, and the terrible stillness creeping into her limbs. He didn't speak. There were no words for a father to offer in such a moment, not when the child in his arms trembled like a candle in a draught, nor when the kitchen that should have held warmth instead carried the stench of neglect. Jack rose abruptly, lifting Emily with the instinct of someone who had carried wounded comrades before, but never one whose heartbeat meant more to him than his own. Rex moved in perfect synchrony, flanking them as a shield, his body rigid and alert as they hurried through the living room toward the door. Behind them, Vanessa spoke again, still languid, still detached, but her words fell away in the chaos of Jack's racing pulse, their meaning already irrelevant against the urgency pounding inside him. The storm outside roared like an old companion, and Jack burst into it with Emily in his arms, Rex at his heels, and the cold night swallowing them whole. The truck door flew open, and Jack laid Emily across the seat with a tenderness fractured by fear, wiping the damp strands of hair from her face as Rex curled tightly against her legs, guarding even in the cramped space. Jack started the engine with shaking hands, the roar of the motor swallowing the sound of the rain as he pulled onto the road. Emily stirred faintly, her voice emerging in a thin, quivering whisper that reached him only because he was listening for life itself. "I'm sorry," she breathed, her words breaking as though pulled from a place deeper than pain. "I'm sorry I ate slow. Dad, don't be mad." The apology pierced him more sharply than any wound he had suffered before, carrying a truth no child should believe about love or survival. The hospital lights cut through the storm as Jack pulled into the emergency lane, his truck sliding to a stop with a screech that drew nurses rushing forward. A woman in her 50s with silver hair tied in a bun, Dr. Marianne Hollis, an experienced pediatrician with calm eyes that had seen too many cases like this, took Emily into her arms with a swift authority softened by compassion. She wore navy scrubs and a stethoscope slung loosely around her neck, her expression tightening the moment she felt Emily's weight and saw the pallor beneath her eyelashes. Jack followed closely, answering the brief, urgent questions with a voice thick from holding back every emotion that threatened to break through the surface. Dr. Hollis moved with purpose through the fluorescent-lit corridor, her face a blend of practiced composure and unmistakable alarm. Hours later, when she finally returned to Jack in the waiting room, her expression had settled into a sober calm, her hands folded gently in front of her as though bracing herself to deliver words that would reshape a father's understanding of what had happened to his child. She explained that Emily had suffered severe food poisoning from rotten scraps and showed signs of acute malnutrition, her small body pushed past limits no child should reach. "Another few hours," she said in a careful voice, "and the consequences might have been irreversible." Jack listened without interrupting, without breathing deeply, without moving at all, his hands pressed together as if holding on to a promise he wasn't sure he had fulfilled in time. When the police arrived to take statements, Agnes Whitmore appeared in the waiting area, wrapped in a knitted shawl and still trembling from the night's events. Her gray hair lay damp beneath her hood, and her eyes, tired but resolute, held the weight of someone finally able to speak aloud what she had witnessed. She provided her account with clarity, her voice steadying as she recounted the days of silence, the smell in the hallway, and the unease she could no longer ignore. In that moment she became more than a neighbor. She became the voice that lifted truth into the open, anchoring it in a place where someone could finally act. The morning settled heavily over Canyon Hill as the storm clouds thinned into a gray veil, leaving the streets damp and silent in the unsettling calm that often follows nights filled with too much truth. Officers moved with steady purpose through the narrow halls of the apartment building, their radios crackling softly in the quiet, and the distant hum of traffic drifting from the street below, as if the world outside continued unaware of the darkness revealed within these walls. The air inside the unit still carried the sour, lingering smell of neglect, and every corner seemed sharper in the daylight, as though the truth itself had gained shape. Rex padded beside the lead investigator with ears angled forward, the large German shepherd alert yet disciplined, his trained instincts guiding him with a certainty only an animal unburdened by denial could possess. Jack stood near the doorway, his tired face lined by hours without rest, watching with a father's vigilance as the officers worked, knowing that whatever they uncovered now would speak for a child who had endured more than she ever should have. In the kitchen, where the dim bulb flickered the night before, a female officer in her early 40s knelt near the base cabinets, her movements deliberate and precise. She wore her dark hair in a tight bun, her uniform crisp despite the early hour, and her expression carried the calm focus of someone who had built resilience out of years spent seeing the worst in people. Rex nudged her elbow softly before lowering his snout toward a narrow gap beneath the cabinet frame, his body stiffening with the kind of alertness that conveyed unmistakable meaning. She exchanged a glance with her partner, a heavy-set man in his 50s, whose salt and pepper beard gave him the weary appearance of someone who believed little could surprise him anymore, yet even he leaned closer with a seriousness sharpened by curiosity. With a gloved hand, the officer reached into the space, her fingers brushing against cold metal, before she drew out a rectangular steel box coated in a thin layer of dust. It was the sort of container people used when they wanted something hidden rather than stored, and the chill of the metal felt almost symbolic in her grip. The box was heavier than expected, its contents shifting faintly with a dull thud as she set it on the floor. A soft click echoed when she unlatched it, and as the lid lifted, the stale air inside the apartment seemed to tighten as if bracing for what lay within. Jack did not move closer, but he watched with unblinking focus, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Inside the metal box lay a stack of notebooks bound with aging elastic bands, their corners frayed and pages swollen from fingerprints and time. The covers were labeled in Vanessa's sharp handwriting: discipline log, behavior corrections, and other titles that made the officers exchange troubled glances. Beside the notebooks sat loose sheets of paper, each covered with short clipped instructions written in the same cold script, some explicitly detailing which spoiled foods were to be given as punishment and at what intervals. The final layer beneath the papers revealed several USB drives, each marked with dates, as though cataloging episodes of cruelty with the same efficiency one might use to organize vacation photos. The officer closed her eyes briefly, steadied herself, and then lifted the items carefully, documenting them one by one while Rex sat at her side like a sentinel. The male officer plugged one of the drives into his department-issued tablet, and the screen lit up with thumbnails of videos each labeled with a date and time. When he opened the first file, the volume remained muted, but no sound was needed for the footage to pierce the room. The screen showed Emily standing timidly at the kitchen counter, her hands clasped together as Vanessa loomed behind her, pointing sharply toward the trash bin. Another video captured a moment where Emily sat alone at the table, forced to chew on something she clearly struggled to swallow, as Vanessa recorded with the cold detachment of a documentarian rather than a parent. The frames of the videos flickered in the dim living room, each frozen image revealing layers of a long, deliberate pattern that no argument could soften or excuse. Evidence mounted with every file opened and every page turned, forming a mosaic of neglect and cruelty. The officers moved through the apartment with a quiet urgency, photographing the areas where the moldy bread had been found, the trash bin with its rotting contents, and the corners where cleaning supplies and food were inexplicably locked away. Each detail reinforced the narrative emerging from the metal box, creating a timeline of harm built not from impulse, but from a deliberate pattern that made the officers' faces grow tighter with each passing minute. Rex remained near the investigators, occasionally returning to Jack's side to nudge his hand with a gentle reassurance that felt painfully tender in the midst of so much cold evidence. Meanwhile, upstairs in the small bedroom Vanessa had claimed as her own, two officers began searching through the dresser and closet, their movements quick and efficient. Clothing was folded neatly, makeup arranged in pristine rows, and a suitcase lay open on the bed, with several outfits already packed as though she expected to be gone before questions could reach her doorstep. A younger officer, a man in his late 20s with sharp cheekbones and a thoughtful gaze, ran his fingers along the edges of the suitcase and found a stack of envelopes filled with cash tucked beneath a layer of neatly folded blouses. His brows furrowed and he passed the evidence to his partner, their shared glance acknowledging the unmistakable intent behind the hurried packing. The knock at the apartment door came louder than expected, breaking the muted hum of investigation. 2 officers stood outside with handcuffs ready, and when Vanessa appeared from the bedroom, she did so with an eerie calm that unsettled even those who had encountered hardened criminals. She was dressed in a fitted black sweater and dark jeans, her hair brushed and makeup intact as though she were preparing for a casual outing rather than attempting to flee the consequences gathering at her feet. Her gaze traveled across the officers without fear or anger, landing briefly on the suitcase still open on her bed, before returning to the faces watching her with a mix of disbelief and restraint. One officer stepped forward, informing her of the arrest with the steady authority of someone who had practiced the procedure countless times, yet the gravity in his tone revealed how this case differed from the others he had handled. Vanessa lifted her wrists with a delicate, almost dismissive gesture, allowing the handcuffs to encircle them without struggle. Her chin lifted as she glanced around the room, her expression smooth, indifferent, untouched by the severity of the charges she now faced. "I taught her the right way," she said, her voice devoid of regret or doubt, the words floating into the silence like shards of ice. The room stiffened with reaction, but no one responded. The officers guided her toward the hallway as she maintained the same cold poise, her steps careful, her posture straight, as though she remained convinced of her own righteousness despite the evidence stacked against her. Rex growled once, low and controlled, from where he stood at Jack's side, his instincts recognizing something deeply wrong in the woman's unsettling composure. Jack did not move to speak or intervene. He simply watched, his breath steadying with the knowledge that what had been hidden was now laid bare for the world to see. As the officers escorted her out, the metal box remained on the table, its contents catalogued, photographed, and sealed for transport. Each notebook, each note, each recording formed a chain strong enough to ensure the truth would hold under scrutiny. The apartment, once sounding with denial and silence, now held the weight of justice gathering its form. The door closed behind the officers, leaving the rooms quieter than before, but the stillness carried a different meaning now. No longer the oppressive hush of secrets, but the measured calm that follows when truth finally finds air. For a long moment, Jack remained where he stood, his gaze fixed on the remnants of evidence spread across the table. The walls felt wider somehow, as though the shadows had retreated in the wake of what had been uncovered. Rex pressed gently against his leg, offering the quiet companionship only a loyal dog could give, and Jack let a slow breath escape him, not with relief, but with a solemn acknowledgement of a chapter that had reached its rightful end. The morning light crept across the floor, settling softly over the worn linoleum, and in that dim glow the weight of the night's revelations eased into something steadier, something that belonged to the truth alone. The courthouse stood beneath a pale winter sky, its stone steps slick from the early morning frost, and the air thick with a hush that felt heavier than silence itself, as though the building carried the weight of everything the public had learned in the past days. Reporters gathered behind barricades with microphones raised, speaking in hushed tones about the shocking evidence released by investigators, and citizens hovered nearby with somber faces, unable to look away from a story that had ignited collective outrage. Inside the main hall, the corridors hummed with subdued tension as officers escorted witnesses to their seats and attorneys reviewed their notes with the stiff composure that came from years of navigating other people's tragedies. Jack walked slowly through the hall with Emily resting against his shoulder, her small body bundled in a soft gray coat that swallowed her frame, while Rex trotted at his side with steady, purposeful steps, the German shepherd's calm presence serving as a silent reassurance amid the whispers and pointed glances that surrounded them. The atmosphere felt almost sacred, not in reverence, but in the way people instinctively quiet themselves when truth is finally about to be spoken aloud. Inside the courtroom, sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating rows of polished wooden benches and casting long shadows across the oak-paneled walls. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe twist and eyes sharpened by decades on the bench, sat with an unwavering posture that radiated authority. Her black robe draped around her like a mantle of responsibility, and her expression held none of the anger swirling through the public. It was steadiness, the kind forged through patience and painful necessity. The prosecutor, a man in his mid-40s with wire-rimmed glasses and a navy suit pressed with meticulous care, arranged his folders atop the lectern. His demeanor was solemn, marked by a quiet drive that suggested he carried the burden of this case with personal conviction rather than professional obligation. He looked to the jury only once before lowering his gaze, as if acknowledging the gravity they had been asked to absorb. The trial began with the prosecutor's voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room, calm, yet edged with a firmness that settled heavily on each listener. He described, in deliberate sequence, the evidence collected from the apartment, The metal box, the meticulous logs, the instructions dictating punishments, the videos that captured the chilling detachment of someone recording harm rather than preventing it. His tone remained steady, refusing theatrics, allowing the facts to stand stark and unembellished in the air. Vanessa sat at the defense table, wrists free but posture rigid, her expression unreadable beneath subtle makeup and smooth blonde hair pulled behind her shoulders, her eyes darting only occasionally toward Jack as though gauging how deeply she had fractured the world he fought to protect. The prosecutor's final words lingered in the room like cold wind. This was not a momentary lapse but a pattern, intentional and planned, a deliberate campaign of harm inflicted upon a child. Jack held Emily closer as the details unfurled, feeling her fingers curl into the collar of his jacket whenever the prosecutor's tone dipped into something too sharp, too heavy for a child to bear. She wore a white headband that kept her now clean hair tucked away from her face, but her eyes, still large and cautious, shifted anxiously whenever a loud noise echoed in the room. Rex sat beside their bench, his powerful body still but alert, glancing occasionally toward Emily with a softness that belied the intensity he had shown in darker moments. Across the aisle, the public gallery filled with neighbors, strangers, and community members who had followed the case, their expressions ranging from disbelief to grief to a simmering anger that no one voiced aloud out of respect for the solemnity of the proceedings. Even the courtroom deputies, seasoned and disciplined, could not entirely mask the tension in their posture. When Vanessa was asked to stand, she rose with an elegance that contrasted sharply with the content of the accusations read aloud. She wore a fitted charcoal dress and a faint, almost polite smile that made the jury shift uneasily, as though her calm itself were another form of violence. The defense attempted to argue stress, mental strain, unstable emotions, but their words faltered beneath the weight of the evidence already presented, the meticulous notes, the tone of the recordings, the consistency of the punishments. Vanessa listened with a distant air, as if the details being read belonged to someone else entirely, someone she had never met. When the prosecutor paused and invited her to respond, she spoke only one sentence, her voice carrying across the room with a chill that gripped even those who had prepared themselves. "I taught her the right way," she said simply, her expression as smooth and unmoved as stone. A murmur rippled across the courtroom before the judge's gavel cracked sharply, restoring order with a sound that felt as final as a closing door. The jurors exchanged glances heavy with understanding, their collective silence signaling a conclusion already taking shape within them. The judge reviewed the documents before her with slow, deliberate care, each turn of the page adding weight to the atmosphere, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Jack lowered his head briefly, not to avoid the moment, but to gather strength he feared he no longer possessed, while Rex edged closer to Emily, pressing his side gently against her leg as if anchoring her to a world that could still hold safety. When the verdict was finally read, the judge's voice carried a clarity that cut through the morning light with unmistakable conviction. She declared Vanessa guilty on all counts, child abuse, aggravated cruelty, and attempted homicide, and sentenced her to 20 years in state prison, the maximum allowed under the guidelines. There was no gasp from the gallery, no shouts, no triumph, only an exhale that swept across the room like a collective release, heavy and sorrowful, yet resolute. Vanessa blinked once, twice, but her expression did not change. She offered no plea, no tear, no sign of a conscience awakening. The deputy stepped behind her, placing the cuffs on her wrists with steady hands, and she allowed herself to be led away with the same chilling composure she had shown since the beginning. Jack pressed both palms over his face as soon as the gavel struck, not in celebration, but in a mixture of agony and something that felt disturbingly close to relief. His shoulders shook once, silently, as the truth of the sentence settled inside him, not erasing the pain of what Emily had endured, but granting them the fragile possibility of beginning again without the shadow of Vanessa's cruelty looming overhead. Emily looked up at him with tired eyes, confusion flickering in her small, fragile expression, and Jack lowered his hands at once, pulling her into his embrace with a tenderness born of fear and fierce devotion. Rex rested his head against Jack's knee, exhaling deeply as though even he understood that some battles ended not with cheers but with the quiet collapse of a burden finally put down. In the days that followed, Emily's physical injuries healed quickly under the attentive care of nurses, but the deeper wounds clung to her in ways that shook Jack more than any threat of danger. The scent of certain foods made her recoil with a sharp alarm that turned immediately into nausea, and she often pushed her plate away untouched, her small hands trembling as though even hunger felt too dangerous to trust. At times she would nudge Rex gently, pressing her face against his fur in search of comfort, and the dog would curl beside her with a patience that seemed almost human, his warm presence giving her just enough courage to breathe through the panic. Jack watched her with a helplessness he had never felt in war, understanding that the battlefield before him now was one he could not fight with strength alone. The decision to take extended leave from work came to Jack in a quiet moment at the kitchen table, long after Emily had fallen asleep with Rex curled at her feet. He stared at the leave form lying on the wood grain, his pen hovering motionless, as he weighed the choice that was not really a choice at all. His job had defined so much of his life, routine, duty, stability, but none of it meant as much as the child whose safety had once been entrusted to someone unworthy of the responsibility. He signed the form slowly, pressing the pen firmly against the paper as though anchoring his resolve in ink. His absence might stretch weeks, months, longer if needed. The only thing that mattered now was being present for the fragile, trembling journey his daughter had to take back toward trust. When the night finally settled across their home, the world grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, gentler, softer, touched by a hope too tentative to name yet unmistakably alive. Jack sat beside Emily's bed, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead as she slept, her breath steady but still tinged with the remnants of fear. Rex curled at the foot of the bed like a guardian carved from warmth and loyalty, opening one eye every few moments to ensure the room remained as still and safe as it appeared. In that dim glow of a small lamp, Jack allowed himself a long, deep breath, not of victory but of commitment, understanding fully that healing would not come easily, but it would come. And for the first time in a long while, the weight on his chest eased, not erased but softened, by the quiet certainty that they were finally moving toward the light. The weeks that followed settled gently over the Carter household, bringing with them a quieter rhythm that seemed almost fragile at first, as though the walls themselves were learning how to breathe again after months spent holding in too much fear. Morning light filtered softly through the curtains, warming the wooden floors and painting long, peaceful rays across the rooms where Emily now moved with cautious steps, her small frame still adjusting to a world where safety did not vanish without warning. Jack rose early each day, his presence steady and deliberate as he guided their home into this new chapter, while Rex, ever watchful, patrolled the hallway outside Emily's bedroom with a solemn loyalty that softened only when he lay down beside her bed. The house was no longer defined by silence. Instead, it carried the sound of quiet courage rebuilding itself hour after hour in small gestures and fragile beginnings. Rex had undergone his evaluation at the therapy dog center just days after the trial, and the trainers, seasoned professionals with gentle voices and firm hands, had recognized immediately the bond between him and the little girl he refused to let out of his sight. His 6-year-old body, muscular yet calm, moved with a deliberate softness whenever he approached Emily, positioning himself in ways that made her feel cocooned rather than crowded. The certification came swiftly, stamped with official approval, but carrying a deeper meaning that transcended paperwork. Rex was no longer just a companion or a guardian. He was a stabilizing presence, a therapeutic anchor for a child relearning how to trust the world. Each night he curled at the edge of her mattress, his chin resting on his paws, eyes alert but softened by affection. Emily's recovery unfolded in quiet layers, fragile yet persistent, like petals of a flower slowly opening after being kept too long in the dark. Mealtimes, once fraught with trembling hands and wide-eyed dread, became gentle rituals under Jack's guidance, with Rex sitting patiently at her side as though reminding her she was no longer alone in that vulnerable space. Jack cooked simple, comforting dishes, warm oatmeal, soft scrambled eggs, small bowls of fruit, and placed them before her with patient encouragement, never pushing, never rushing. Sometimes she hesitated, her breath catching when a familiar smell drifted too close, but Rex would nuzzle her knee, offering the subtle reassurance of a presence that asked nothing of her except to breathe. Gradually, spoonful by spoonful, her body learned again what nourishment without fear felt like. Agnes Whitmore became a frequent visitor, though she never stayed long enough to overwhelm Emily. At 72, with soft silver hair tucked beneath knitted hats and warm brown eyes framed by gentle wrinkles, she carried the comforting presence of someone who had spent her life caring quietly for others. The community had begun calling her a silent hero, a title she accepted with embarrassed smiles and modest waves of her hand, insisting she had only done what any neighbor would. Still, the gratitude poured onto her was genuine, and Jack made sure she knew how deeply her instinct, her phone call, and her persistence had mattered. She brought small gifts for Emily, handmade mittens, storybooks, warm berry muffins, and her presence always made the little girl relax just a little more. As stability grew within their home, Jack found himself drawn toward a new purpose, one shaped not by duty alone but by the clarity of what had nearly been lost. He reached out to a local veterans organization that hosted a child protection volunteer program, one designed to train former service members to recognize signs of harm, advocate for vulnerable families, and support at-risk children navigating the legal system. The coordinator, a tall man in his early 40s with kind eyes and a calm voice polished by years of social work, welcomed Jack warmly and spoke with quiet admiration about his commitment. Jack listened with humility, understanding that while he could not undo the past, he could transform its weight into something that protected others. Signing the volunteer ledger felt like placing a steadying hand on a world that too often tilted in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, Emily's world began slowly expanding beyond the confines of fear. She rediscovered small joys, drawing with colored pencils, building towers with wooden blocks, brushing Rex's fur with tiny strokes that made her giggle when he leaned into the touch. Her laughter, soft at first, grew more confident as the days warmed into early spring, drifting through the house like a melody clearing dust from forgotten corners. She followed Jack into the backyard, where winter's last snow patches melted beneath weak sunlight, and Rex bounded alongside her with a protective exuberance that made the neighbors smile. Emily wore simple cotton dresses and soft sweaters in colors she chose herself, small steps toward reclaiming control over the life that had once felt dictated by fear. At times, remnants of trauma surged unexpectedly, a dropped dish, a sudden loud voice, the faint sour scent of leftover food, and Emily would freeze with a shrinking whimper, her face paling as the memory overtook her senses. Jack always moved slowly, lowering himself to her height, speaking in a low, soothing whisper that reminded her she was safe, that the moment belonged to the present and not the shadow of what had been. Rex would press his warm body beside hers, steady and silent, and Emily would eventually relax into the reassurance of two presences that never faltered. Healing did not march forward in straight lines, but it moved nonetheless, carried by the constancy of a father's tenderness and a dog's unwavering devotion. Community members who had followed the case often stopped Jack on the street or at the grocery store, offering kind words that he accepted with quiet gratitude. Some expressed admiration for Rex, who had become something of a local symbol for loyalty, while others shared stories of their own struggles, finding comfort in speaking to someone who had walked through darkness and emerged with his heart still open. Emily rarely strayed from Jack's side during these interactions, her small hand gripping his as she peeked curiously at the people who greeted them with warm smiles, and Rex positioned himself slightly in front of her, forming a subtle barrier that made her feel protected without feeling restricted. Agnes's recognition as the silent hero was celebrated at a small community gathering held at the senior center, where neighbors brought homemade dishes and crafted cards to honor her actions. She attended wearing a soft lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, her cheeks pink with bashfulness, as the mayor, a cheerful woman in her early 60s with a deep appreciation for acts of quiet bravery, presented her with a modest plaque. Emily approached her shyly with a bouquet of wildflowers Jack helped her pick earlier that morning, and Agnes's eyes glistened as she knelt to embrace the little girl who had become a symbol of resilience for the entire neighborhood. The applause that filled the room that afternoon was gentle, warm, and full of gratitude. As spring softened into summer, the Carter home transformed into a haven woven with renewed hope. Emily began sleeping through the night with fewer terrors, and she woke each morning to Rex's gentle nudges, his tail thumping softly against the floor, as if reminding her that joy still existed in the quiet places. Jack kept a journal of her progress, noting each moment of courage: her first meal without trembling, her first laugh without hesitation, the first time she dared to play outside without looking over her shoulder. He filled the pages with gratitude, fear, pride, and everything in between, understanding that healing was not simply a process, but a story worth remembering. On a late afternoon in June, as sunlight pooled lazily through the windows, Emily sat in the backyard with Rex lying across her lap, his warm fur rising and falling with each calm breath. Jack watched from the porch, leaning against the wooden rail with a soft smile, noticing the gentle ease that had begun to settle over them, like a blessing slowly unfolding. Emily traced small shapes on Rex's fur with her fingertip, humming a tune she had made up herself, and Rex responded by lifting his head just enough to nuzzle her cheek before laying it back down. The moment held no grand declarations, no dramatic revelations, only peace, the simple and profound kind that arrives after long nights spent fighting for the right to feel safe. As the sky shifted into a soft wash of gold, Jack stepped down from the porch and sat beside his daughter, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders while Rex shifted to accommodate them both. The three of them formed a small circle of warmth against the quieting day, their shadows stretching across the grass as fireflies began to blink into existence beneath the gathering dusk. Emily leaned her head on Jack's chest, Rex rested his paw across her leg, and the world felt, for the first time in far too long, unbroken. In that delicate glow of early evening, the story that had once been shaped by darkness found its way into the light, rebuilding itself through love, loyalty, and the simple truth that even the smallest family, when held together by genuine care, could become whole again. Sometimes a story leaves us with more than memories. It leaves us with a quiet reminder of what truly holds the world together. Not the grand gestures or the loud victories, but the small acts of courage that happen in silence, the steady loyalty of a faithful heart, the kindness offered when no one is watching. There are people who carry light without ever asking to be seen, and there are moments when their choices change the course of another life. As you sit with this ending, take a moment to let the warmth of that truth settle in you. And if it moves you, share your thoughts in the comments so others can feel a little less alone. If this story touched something in your heart, consider subscribing and staying with us on this journey of compassion and hope. And may God bless you and those you love, guiding your days with gentleness and keeping your spirit brave in a world that still needs quiet protectors.